The following document was recovered from the archived records of the Valith Institute. Its contents have been preserved exactly as they appeared when the investigation was closed. Archive 1, Case File 005. Classification: Atlas. The photograph had spent 28 years in the depths of the archive services before anyone bothered questioning what it was that stood at the center of the image. It was recovered alongside several other records during the internal audit triggered by the discovery of Case File 004, which included a similar photograph among the field logs of an excursion to the same Himalayan valley in 1998. Pages from the log were missing from the provided documents. The original survey maps were lost, and there was no reasonable explanation given for the very existence of the expedition. The photograph remained, along with the negative. The image it captured was the northern end of the valley, framed by the ridges and the river that could still be seen in satellite maps today. Beyond the river, the great stone structure loomed over the valley, its remnants forming a roughly rectangular plateau nearly 30 meters above the ground. Nothing of the sort had ever been found there. Project Atlas reconstituted the image and cross-referenced the terrain with the few surveys available for the region in 1998, finding that the location was real and that the photograph had been taken in the last week of April 1998. If the image was faked, the forger had an uncanny ability to recreate geographical scenery. Whatever the photograph had captured, it had stood there when the film needed it to be there. By the next morning, Atlas had managed to reconstruct the image enough to determine the general location in which it had been taken. It lay 1,700 meters into the valley, on a site that had already been surveyed twice by the Genesis expedition. Whatever structure had stood there prior had long since disappeared, leaving little, if anything, that could be used to reconstruct it. Even if it had been a substantial building made of stone, its foundations and surrounding debris would provide a reasonable approximation as to its former location. That was when a field survey was authorized. The Atlas team reached the coordinates 3 days later and found the river, the surrounding ridges, and the bare slope where the building had, until recently, stood. They set up their own cameras and lenses in the approximate location of the original photograph, hoping to capture a similar image for reference. They did not succeed. The western ridge was positioned too far to the left, 13 meters to be exact, and adjusting to that location resulted in the river being misplaced by the same measure. They tried moving north by 14 meters instead, and found the ridgeline in the correct position, but the river was now far to the right. Even when adjusting to the west to account for it, the eastern mountain was not where it was supposed to be. Every landmark in the photograph remained, but not one of them appeared where it was meant to be. It was no longer a matter of the building not being there. Atlas marked several additional locations to reconstitute the local geometry before taking measurements between the first 2 points with 2 different laser tools. The distance between the first set of survey markers came to 612.4 meters, while the second set measured 608.9 meters. It was enough to warrant further investigation. Outside the surveyed area, the same pair of instruments took consistent readings with less than a millimeter of variance. Inside it, the numbers grew impossibly large with every other measurement, growing to nearly another half a meter when Atlas took additional reference points for the 3rd time that afternoon. It was no longer a matter of the building not being there. Atlas took a moment before answering the transmission from the expedition photographer, who had taken his camera out once more to capture a similar image to the one taken in 1998. He was looking through the lens when he stopped and nearly dropped the device, lowering it slowly as he took in the sight before him. There was nothing there. When he raised the camera once more, the viewfinder showed the western ridge and the river
in the exact positions they had been all day. Between them, however, he noticed the beginning of a long, rough arch of dark stone. He motioned to one of his fellow photographers instead, asking him to look through the lens for a moment. The taller man took it from him and carefully examined the view before saying anything. It too was a ruin.
By morning, 6 members of the Atlas team had peered through the camera, and the discussion had veered into more productive matters than their initial sighting. Each had seen something different, though none were willing to dismiss the other's testimony. 2 men saw an isolated arch like the one in the 1998 photograph, but one of these saw the structure buried beneath a far larger edifice of fallen stone, and the expedition's photographer saw a narrow breach running straight past the arch into the depths of the valley. The latter finding presented an impossibility, as the measured distance to the structure was several hundred meters greater than the valley extended. The camera saw none of these things. Atlas spent the morning charting positions of his observers' sightings, noting that the apparent discrepancy had only occurred upon a single line of sight, running approximately where the survey team's instruments had failed to record properly. Atlas and his colleagues laid down additional reference points for the length of the slope, measuring outwards from the grid towards the general location of the 1998 photograph. By mid-morning, they had established that measurements taken inward from the grid to the sighted structure were coming up shorter by increasing margins, while measurements taken outward from the grid were recovering lost ground. The valley was not as flat as the instruments expected. This, in turn, placed an entirely new slant on the expedition. Atlas was no longer hunting for lost ruins. Now, the valley was the thing in need of discovering. Atlas marked down 24 numbered titanium markers, each fitted with a tracking transmitter to mark fixed locations in the grid without further excavation. The markers remained in place through the afternoon until shortly before 4, when marker 17 vanished from view. Its transmitter remained active. The position it had occupied was an easy walk from the field station, 40 meters beyond the river's edge and well within sight of the valley's slope. 2 men arrived at the location to find it completely unmarked, save for the bare earth. They double-checked the readings while standing directly over the location, but the receiver only continued to report marker 17 hovering just short of where they were standing. Further exploration turned up nothing, and Atlas halted operations before sunset, noting that the vanishing marker had produced another abnormality in his measurements. 16 and 18 were nearly 2 meters apart, despite neither having moved. More intriguingly, the error vanished when distance was measured to either side of marker 17's predicted location. For the first time, the team had an abnormality they could physically interact with. They laid down new reference marks to either side of where marker 17 should have been, marking out an irregular patch of ground about 12 meters across. Walking through the space produced no odd effect, save that instruments and measuring devices used within it produced inconsistent results which vanished upon leaving the span. Further tests through the evening confirmed the effect, and just before nightfall, the expedition photographer reported seeing the darkened arch for the first time. He did not need the camera this time, as it turned out. It hovered at the very edge of the span, staying in view for several seconds before vanishing, and another of the team members standing nearby noted a similar effect. He saw the suggestion of an ancient stone wall stretching back in the opposite direction, while the expedition photographer saw an opening leading into the depths beneath the slope.
Their accounts did not agree on much, but both men saw evidence of something in the same stretch of Earth. Marker 17 reappeared just before 2:14 in the morning. The field station's receiving array registered the marker first, and Atlas and his colleagues arrived to find it standing on the very ground they had marked for it. No trace of excavation marked the site, and the marker itself was intact, its internal chronometer running steady for the 10 hours it had been absent. Something was different, however, in the span of land it had occupied before vanishing. A thin coating of dark, almost oily material clung to the lower edge of the titanium shaft, and a sample of it was taken back to the field station, where initial analysis revealed it to be a peculiarly dense silicate with an abnormally high content of iron and a few trace elements not found in any local stone. One member of Atlas's team went back over the 1998 photograph in the meanwhile, enlarging the image to see if he could discern anything unusual about the face of the nearest arch. He did not get clear resolution on the stone itself, but the surface was oddly dark in places and bore small flecks of metal, much like the sample retrieved from Marker 17's site.
The comparison was passed on to the Institute before sunrise, and a response came back within an hour. Archive Services had already been holding on to a sample from the same valley, taken in April of 1998. Archive Services verified that the recovered material matched a sample from the valley taken in April of 1998, though the file attached to the older specimen was apparently classified. Project Atlas received the composition report, along with nothing else. By then, they had a more pressing concern. The distortions plaguing their grid were growing stronger. In the span of 2 days, Atlas painstakingly charted every variation against the timeline and found that the fluctuation in distance, direction, and transmission followed the same pattern. Reports of the ruins appeared near the rises and drops in the graph, and by the third afternoon, they had a rough estimate on when the next spike would occur. They set their preparations there. Cameras, both digital and analog, were placed around the grid, and the survey equipment fed calculations to the field station as usual. Shortly after 4:30, the distance between markers 9 and 12 began to shrink, and others soon followed. Soon after, the computer's generated image no longer overlaid the real world. The discrepancy grew for another 4 minutes before the ruins appeared. They were unmistakable to every member of the expedition. A thoroughfare carved through the northern side of the valley, where it had previously been bare ground, bordered by shattered walls and columns of the same black stone as Marker 17. The unearthed buildings stretched to lengths far beyond what the 1998 photograph suggested, vanishing into the folds of the valley beyond the ruins. For a few seconds, both the old and new worlds stood side by side, close enough to inspect the cracks in the stone and the gaps between buildings on either side. The arch in the background of the original shot dominated the space beyond the river. It was larger than the one in Atlas's photo, connected to the remains of a building that stretched outside the frame in both directions. Along it, another avenue led back down the valley towards several distant towers. Everything vanished 11 seconds later. The grid remained whole, although it took several minutes for the instruments to return to their previous readings. Digital footage was lost altogether, and the landscape rendered in the computer was littered with patches that didn't match the real terrain. The analog cameras captured 4 shots, 3 of which showed a clear view of the valley. The last one captured the ruins. It showed the thoroughfare and the 3 distant towers, along with the great arch framing the avenue. One of Atlas's researchers recognized this layout instantly, and she immediately requested media from case file 003. The comparison reached Project Mnemosyne later that evening. Several months prior, They'd compiled hundreds of drawings from children who recalled detailed memories of a city they'd never seen. All of them contributed to the partially reconstructed image of the city beneath three moons, a place Mnemosyne labeled inaccessible to human inquiry. One particular district was left incomplete, as the recollections differed on the details of its outer buildings. The new image fit the known records precisely. The spacing between avenues was identical, and the Great Arch stood in the center as expected. The three towers completed the district, a detail Mnemosyne's researchers hadn't been able to recreate from memory. For the first time, two of the Institute's projects had seen the same structures, using entirely different methods. That discovery in itself was enough to change the classification of case file 005. Atlas worked from a photograph and an issue with geometric precision, while Mnemosyne used human memory to reach similar conclusions. The Genesis project was already aware of the valley, as unrelated biological occurrences placed it at the center of their investigation. 3 lines of research had reached the same inaccessible location without intending to, and the case was brought before Echo Review by the following midnight. Mercer arrived at the archive services the next morning with the same worn leather briefcase he'd carried for every Echo mission since case file 001. Waiting on the table was the photograph from Atlas. Mercer spent several long minutes analyzing it, taking note of the details surrounding the Great Arch before he turned the image over. Whatever he saw there kept him from turning it again as he paused in his next breath. Those following could only see the faded script scrawled across the paper on the reverse side. "Don't let them reach here," was all that remained legible beneath the damage. Beneath it, the remainder of a signature was barely visible, its meaning obscured by time, save for the single letter M. Mercer returned the photograph to the table and requested the remaining records from the 1998 survey in the valley. 43 minutes later, he received a file from Archive Services containing the field sheets from the original survey. Among them was a sheet dated 27th April of 1998, which had been completed shortly before they'd found the camp nearly 2 kilometers to the south. The name of the researcher responsible for it appeared at the bottom of the page. Mercer. Mercer remained at Archive Services while the 1998 records were retrieved, though he provided no clarification as to his involvement with the expedition. What remained was disappointingly sparse. 17 sets of field sheets, a few photographs, a partially destroyed equipment registry, and a survey report that abruptly terminated at the end of its final page. It was, nevertheless, sufficient to indicate that the Atlas team had followed much the same ground 28 years earlier. The 1998 survey had been conducted after discovering a discrepancy in the aerial records, and their first measurements were taken from the riverbank, with an extended survey beginning to the north on the slope. Within 4 days, the team was noting differences in the distances to the same set of reference points, and on the morning of the 27th of April, Mercer took a photograph of the structure. The orderly sequence in which these notes had been recorded became increasingly difficult to discern after that. Some of the later references indicated buildings that were not present in the expedition's maps, and several field sheets stated that a road continued beyond the northern incline. One set of notes displayed a measurement of more than 4 kilometers between 2 points only half a kilometer apart on the original survey, while another included a rough sketch of the arch, together with a note for the team to cease work if it became visible without optical assistance. The final record was dated the 29th of April. After that, the expedition appears to have been terminated prematurely. Atlas questioned Mercer concerning the interruption, and he explained that the overlap had since dissipated. It was the first time anyone connected with case file 005 had ever heard the expression used, and the working report included the new terminology for the first time that afternoon. Before retrieving the equipment, Atlas requested that the team retrace their steps to marker 17. The mineral deposit had already been dismounted for examination, revealing a handful of shallow gouges along the length of the titanium shaft, as far as the original measurements had indicated. Closer inspection of the expanded photographs showed a pattern pressed into the metal, severe enough to leave an imprint in the titanium. The 1998 equipment registry included a photograph of an aluminium post recovered during the Mercer survey. The same impression was present along its lower edge. Clearly, whatever force had produced the markings on marker 17 had done so long before the Atlas team discovered the site. Atlas now possessed enough information to conclude the mission, as far as case file 005 was concerned. The photograph had captured a genuine set of markings, and the building it depicted had been real, if only for the duration of the overlap. At such times, it would appear within the valley, separating the coordinates, rendering them both simultaneously accessible, separating them long enough for light or distance, or in the case of marker 17, material, to cross the division. The explanation for the photograph was entirely satisfactory. Fewer reassurances were provided concerning the contents of the picture. The comparison with case file 003 meant that the ruins were now located inside the Namazani construct, and the 1998 records confirmed that the same set of coordinates had been accessible 28 years earlier in the same manner. Project Echo, then, requested that the Atlas records be filed not as an isolated anomaly, but as a convergence point to be reviewed in conjunction with the other cases. The expedition was recalled from the valley on the morning of the 6th of May. Mercer arrived before the equipment transfer had begun, wearing the same leather carry case over his shoulder. The Atlas leader questioned him once more about the notation on the back of the 1998 photograph, and Mercer examined the yellowed warning before replacing it in its protective sleeve. When asked whether the remaining M belonged to his own signature, he indicated that there was insufficient remainder to be certain. He was, however, willing to confirm one other observation. The structure had been visible on more than one occasion during the 1998 survey, and the Atlas team had managed to reach beyond it on the last day before the overlap ceased.
Case file 005 was formally closed, with recommendations that future expeditions continue to monitor the valley's anomalies. Project Atlas maintained jurisdiction over the physical records, while those concerning the convergence were transferred to Echo Review for their cross-case analysis. The sole lingering mystery was presented with the mineral sample from marker 17. Archive services had located the corresponding 1998 record during the final inventory, together with the catalog card, which included handwritten notes from Mercer himself. The composition of the mineral was identical within the limits of both records, and the writing on the 1998 card was also confirmed as belonging to Mercer. Only 5 words had been written concerning the location of the sample. We covered beyond the first structure. There was no accompanying map, and no indication of what else the 1998 team had discovered beyond the arch. There was, however, one final notation on the back of the catalog card. It had been written before the expedition returned to the Institute for the final time. Next recurrence, 2026. Several weeks after case file 005 was closed, Archive Services found another page from Mercer's 1998 Valley Report. It was dated April 30th, the morning after his team returned from beyond the structure. Most of it dealt with the expedition, but near the bottom, Mercer had added an instruction that had nothing to do with the survey. If any Institute facility detected a structured transmission of unknown origin, it was to be reported directly to him, and nobody was to answer it without his authorization. He gave no reason for the order. 7 months later, Observatory K-17 received the transmission that became Case File 001. Mercer arrived that afternoon. He listened to the recording for 43 minutes, then asked the staff the question preserved in the original transcript. Has anyone attempted to reply?
Nobody at K-17 understood why that was the first thing he wanted to know. The page recovered from the Valley records finally gave some context to his reaction. Beside the instruction he had issued in April, Mercer had written, "We have seen what happened after the first response. There will not be a second." Years later, when Project Echo proposed sending a controlled mathematical reply to the K-17 signal, Mercer rejected the request. No transmission was ever authorized. The rest of his April report was transferred to Archive 0 and remains restricted.